My name's Steve Hughes from Primary Hughes Illustration, and I'm going to be working on a colored pencil drawing of some orange juice, a couple donuts, a bag, on a napkin on a wooden table. And what I've laid out already for you here is a very faint contour drawing. It's completed with the colored pencil so that the blending of the color right up to the edges will not be affected by a graphite drawing. Because of the transparency that's inherent to colored pencil, it would show the graphite through, and so I'm trying to avoid the graying of the color that would happen if I had graphite along the contour edges. So as you notice, some of it's pretty light. The paper bag, which is going to be a white paper bag, has a very faint gray outline. The cup, the glass here, has a little bit of a bluish gray as well, a little darker. Orange juice has an orange, yellow ochre color. And the donuts, being chocolate donuts, which you'll see as it gets going on underway, needs a dark brown. So what I've essentially done is used more of a local color, color that will disappear into the actual painting process here. And I'm going to get started with the background. It's on a wooden table, so I'm going to go in with, this is a Prismacolor pencil, and it's a burnt ochre because the wood is kind of a blondish color. I'm going to be working with the wood grain, the darkest parts first. I'll lay in a few of those lines here on the video, and then I'll pause it and finish it up and come back in with the next process. So it really is about trying to identify the value, and not necessarily going too dark with this, because it's going to be easier to darken than it is to lighten. And so the process is, it's more of a drawing process at the moment, going in and laying in some of the rings that are visible in the wood back here. And because wood grain is pretty forgiving in terms of accuracy, it's a good place to get started. You can warm up if you've had to take a break between the contour drawing and cleaning that up before you get in and do a little bit more painting. So I'm being very light with these right now so that if they end up being in the wrong position, it's easy to recover the drawing. Now this area will be in shadow, so it's also more forgiving in terms of that. My initial lay-ins are going to be pretty loose, with a sort of oval pattern where I lay the color back down on the stroke towards me. And there will certainly be some overlap, so I've taken it one direction, coming back a different direction. So this whole area here is a little bit darker overall. So I'm going to go through and kind of reach this similar quality around the drawing and adjust the brightness as I go. I'm sure this will need to go a little bit darker, but I'm trying to lay on just a little bit of the color at a time, so it's not building up the wax too much, only as much as I actually need on the surface to get to the value and darkness that I know that the piece will become. So it's a little less of a textural quality up here with pattern. There's some small little moments here or there that I may end up going back over top with, that they're kind of dotted elements, but I'm going to keep moving along. And you know, the table here has a local color change that's going to have a darkness shift inherent to the construction, with two different pieces of wood here, and this one being a little darker for a moment, which I liked because it's going to provide more contrast on the glass here. And I'm going to weave the direction here around it. And my piece of Bristol that I'm working on isn't taped down, so I have the ability to move it around to get into a comfortable position as needed. I want to avoid putting my hand down on my drawing too much, so my hand is raised for the most part off the surface, and I'm just letting the gravity and weight of the pencil kind of push some color down. So this is wood in this area as well, but there's really very little visible grain, but because I've already sort of been thinking about this process here, I will be putting some directional strokes here with the darker, very faint, hopefully it's picking up on camera, for some irregularity, to change it up from what may happen in the bag. So if there's a directional grain here, it'll flow through behind all the elements, and it's possible that the bag may have a directional grain this way to kind of contrast the two. Alright, so I'm going to come down towards the front where there's quite a few more visible marks. I'll do a few here and then I'll finish it off camera. So light lines, they feather on the edge so that if they are a little off, it's easier to blend them out. And I'm using the landmarks that I've already set up here to kind of place without being overly precise. There's a little curvature going on here. So I'm looking at the space, the negative space between, this is a cast shadow from the donut, so I'm looking at that space and that gutter and how it tapers or gets a little narrower. Get a nice rhythm with essentially a double line. And as I kind of get closer to the value and the darkness that needs to be, I can go in with a little thin stroke in between them to add that extra little bit of detail. The thing about detail, though, is we want to make sure that we're confident with the other choices that we've already made before we get in and make something incredibly precise and detailed in the wrong spot. So we want to make sure that everything else is working in our favor before that final touch kind of brings it to completion. So I'm going to go through and bring a few more of these lines around, and we'll come back and take a look at the next step. Okay, as you can see, I've started to take the wood grain a little bit further in the background, and that includes bringing a cast shadow from certain elements, whether it's the glass or the darkness change from one side to the other, because this bag is casting a shadow on the table as well. I've been working with Prismacolor pencil still, working with burnt ochre and a little light umber. There's a sort of reddish cast to one and a greenish cast to the other, just to start to get the local color and temperature shifting that's happening on the wood grain. So to carry this forward a little bit, we've got a little bit darker shadow from the donut, because there's not as much light coming through like the glass is able to do. And this is nowhere near as dark as it will eventually become, but it's an underpainting right now. It's literally the first pass, and we continue to add as we go. But I'm going to be pushing a little bit firmer here from the get-go. And still working with the warmer color. There's a bit of a glow up here towards the top portion of this cast shadow. And this is going to start to show through subsequent layers in the final piece. And when I'm looking at the cast shadow, I'm looking at, well, what's the lightest tone that I can represent in there. And my light source has a bit of a diffused edge on the cast shadow, so there's a softness to it. That's what I'm looking at first here. There's going to be a darker moment within this shadow as well, but I'm washing over essentially the biggest area that I can with a unifying tone or value. That way it will set up the value contrast a little bit quicker, and you can really analyze your shapes. I'll be looking at this edge here pretty clearly, and I see this warmth sort of taper out. I'm going to move to the a darker brown. Got a light umber, a dark umber, and I'm looking for a dark brown, which has a little bit more of the warmth in comparison to the umber. I'll be doing some other colors in here as well as I see this going down. It looks a little grayer in comparison, but I'm looking to create that impression of value, impression of brightness, contrast that's happening between the table that's receiving light over here and the difference in the cast shadow. So I'm coming after this from different directions. I am especially aware of the grain of the table surface, and so that's something I want to keep in mind. And go back to the warmer brown here and start to transition that in. And I'm not scribbling across the surface, I am really trying to feather the edge of each stroke so that a little light pressure at the beginning, firmer pressure in the middle of the stroke, light pressure on the end, so that I don't get any darkened overlap marks. But it's not the only way. We can certainly take little circles and lay tone in. I want to be aware of how sharp my point is and allow that to help get into the grain of the paper. It's going to be darker by a lot, but I'm practicing technique. I'm also trying to keep each layer clean, which requires then less fixing, less adjustment as you get closer to the final piece, or closer to the final finished drawing or painting here. And so I'm going to continue working on the cast shadow, try to get most of the wood grain resolved in here. I have also dropped in a darker kind of red-violet as a first coat for a deep sort of recessed dark that's down there underneath the table. And that's going to layer green and a blue, a dark blue, so that there's going to be sort of a complementary mixture going on with the green and over top of the red-violet. And the blue adds a little bit of coolness and more darkness, so it'll sink back pretty nicely. Those same colors I'll start to use and filter around in here as well, but I'm setting that down so that I kind of bring this thing up in layers, so that I can see the brightness contrast. This is going to go darker anyway, but I can see how the contrast is starting to happen. I'll be rendering here while I'm looking down here, knowing that this needs to be brighter than the recessed dark. So I'm going to get this a little bit more resolved, touch a few more things, and then I'll move on to the brightness, the color, the local color that leans a little bit more yellow-orange, and that's going to start to burnish the pattern of the wood grain together. It's going to start to smooth out a little bit more. So I'll take this a little bit further, and I'll come back and do a little bit more with the video. Okay, I've taken the wood grain to a point where there's detail marks that showcase the texture, and I've also started to encourage the cast shadows with the first layer, mixing a couple different tones and starting to look at the light pattern. The light coming through the bottom of the glass creates a little brightness. So there's a little bit of the specific contrast between light and shadow that I'm starting to play across here as well. And the next step for me is to take both yellow ochre and beige colored pencil here and introduce a little bit of blending. It's going to take some of the texture out of this and burnish it a bit. So lighter colors will usually do that with the colored pencil. One of the things I'm going to be looking for is also the effect of the light falling off across my table surface. So with the light placed on the left side, it's going to be brightest both at the top corner up here and the bottom corner, and look for a gradation across. So you can take two routes here. We can jump and start to essentially create the halftone of the light and work towards the bright. And we can also look at beginning down here, and that's likely where I'm going to start, is just starting to establish the key light tone with some directional marks and say this is going to be the brightest light on the table surface, so everything else will diminish as the light falls off across. And so as I'm drawing over here, I'm looking over here and trying to make that reference point. This is not going to be the last coat. There's going to be a little more subtlety that I'm going to want to bring to some of these texture marks, and that can come with the colorless blender a little bit, as well as going back to the dark tone for a moment or two, add some accent color. And not to bore you on the video, but I'm going to take this across to about here before I start to work the opposite way. And so I'm going to do the same thing up here at the top, which is pretty much equal in brightness. I did lay in a little bit of textural quality there. There's not a lot of wood grain visible there, though as I look at the overall piece develop, I may end up choosing to reintroduce some wood grain marks there for clarity's sake. So I'm going to take that in, fill that in up there. But I'm also going to bring the yellow ochre, which is certainly going to be a little bit more saturated in temperature and color. And I'm going to work the opposite way. There's going to be a little bit of mixture absolutely necessary into the cast shadow. So I'm going to start at that transition point, because where light meets the dark, you do find a little bit more strength in the saturation. And this is something that naturally is going to happen on a form, and it's something that artistically we can add some license to do it a little bit more in the cast shadow as well. So you're not always going to see an increase in saturation there at that transition between the light and the shadow, but it's something that I personally like to encourage, as it adds a little bit of excitement along that edge. Alright, so this yellow ochre, since I'm introducing it here as the more or less local color of our table surface, it does need to represent itself in the shadow anyway. Otherwise, you're not going to get that effect of transparency of that cast shadow laying on the same surface. But I may not be pushing quite as hard initially in the cast shadow. I want to just work that up bit by bit. My directional strokes are, for the most part, working with the wood grain itself. That way, if any of the marks lay down with a little bit more pressure than I really intended, it's going to give the appearance of a continuation of the wood grain. And so I'm going to take and lay this in across the surface, for the most part, all the way up and down. Not really the most interesting thing to watch, but this is where you can sit back and listen to some music and just focus on laying it in flat. So I'm going to take a step away. We'll come back and I'll have this completely filled in. I'll talk about a little bit more the next step. But I'm beginning with the ground here so that I can establish the relationship with the figures, the donuts and the glass and the bag, relative to the ground, and really encourage that brightness relationship to start to happen. Alright, so I'm going to fill this in. As I get down here, there's going to be a transitional step where that beige that was starting brighter over here, I'm lessening the pressure. You can see it's almost the same color as you look at it. The beige is going to burnish it a little bit more like white. The white colored pencil will. So I'm going to use a little less pressure here and essentially create a gradation of saturation towards the shadow half, essentially, or where we're starting to get more to the half tone of the light on the surface. Okay? Okay, so I've taken that coat of the yellow ochre and some of the beige, moving from beige to yellow ochre. I've also taken and started to push some of the cast shadows a little bit darker in areas using a clay rose color, as well as pushing the beginnings of a difference between the way the glass overlaps the wood grain and the direction of the temperature of the color that shifts maybe a little greener in here, a little redder here, and I'm going to continue to work in here for the moment, starting to push the shadows a little bit darker, all relative to a point of white. There's a nice highlight in here. This will not be completely white when I'm finished, but there is a spot in there that's very bright, and I can use that as a quick comparison. And so I need to take this whole area a little bit darker. I'm pretty confident about the color here, that it could maybe go a little bit darker, but it's at a good point. And as a finishing step over that to darken it just a little bit more, I'm using a colorless blender. It will remove some of the paper grain out of that and smooth it out a little bit. So as you use this, it will darken things a little bit. And so I've started to go over the top of this area here, this little eye and the wood grain. And I'm going to continue to match that color. This will go a little bit darker, but I'm looking at this being a relationship right here that I'd like to continue making. And so some of the initial colors that I was using, the light umber and burnt ochre, to lay in the cast shadows originally, I'll continue pushing those in. And it's about layers. We've put down the underpainting with this originally, introduced a little bit of the yellow ochre, sort of a natural local color to the wood, the blonde kind of wood. I'm looking for the layers to mix. So you can certainly take any of these steps and repeat them as needed. As you see the relationships develop, it doesn't need to be like a screen print where once you've used a color, you're kind of done with it, and then you move on to the next screen and print. So I'm not treating this like one layer is done, next layer is done, and then we're completely finished. As I see something start to develop in the orange juice, it's very likely that something will need to be adjusted in the background. And vice versa. So it's important to be flexible and mindful that we're not computers. We're not going to hit it out of the park on the first layer, even the second layer. So I'm changing directions. I don't want it to kind of halo away from the glass, but I need to keep that edge as sharp as I want it right there. So I'm trying to judge against the relationship of the wood visible through the glass, and know that it needs to go a little darker than what's in there. The glass seems to brighten it a little bit. And so the umber is certainly darkening it. I want to be sure that I'm seeing the temperature change, that there's a little greener cast, there's a little warmer reddish cast here. So as I get closer, I'm going to switch back to the burnt ochre for a little bit more red. And that'll continue to darken. I've got a sharp point, which is something really useful on the pencil to make sure that it gets into the grain and reduces how much pressure you actually really need to use on a colorless blender or any other burnishing color like a white or the beige that I may have been using earlier. So I'm reintroducing some of the wood grain texture now as well. Pattern got just a little lost. It's a subtle wood grain texture. Swapping back to the umber. The bag is casting a shadow down to here, so it's more clear as we're getting closer to the glass right here that there's a contrast between those two tones. But I want to ensure that that keeps happening, so I got to darken that a little bit. And just to see where it's at, I'm going to take the colorless blender over this area. And it's a pretty soft edge to that shadow, so I'm going to kind of blend that out towards the light a bit. See how bright that is and where it needs to go a little darker. I'm going to use the yellow ochre here in a second because there's a little bit more saturation along that edge of the cast shadow. So I want to bring that out again. And this will burnish that texture together. So I'm looking at wood color in the light, this transitional stage where we get to the dark. We can find this little bits of saturation growing. And I'm using some pressure, so it's starting to smooth it a little bit, just like the colorless blender would. Translucency of the color allows us to still see subsequent or earlier layers. But that becomes a darker band that I need to resolve and grade this in. And that's closer to where I'm looking to go. So I'm going to keep layering the darker colors and find that yellow ochre is still a good presence. It's something I don't want to lose in the color of the shadow at least for this first half. As it starts to get closer to the bag, I lose some of the yellow ochre because the coloration of the wood changes. Gets a little redder, a little darker. Okay, I'm continuing to work on darkening the shadows, and I thought it'd be useful to zoom in on the area here with the cast shadow from the glass and the bright caustic light that shows through that shadow. So what I'm paying attention to is really how dark that light is. It's a relationship that I'll be making relative to the highlight there, but there's a really strong bright highlight in here that I'm referencing as well. So it's important to note that the light coming through has color. It has some of this yellow ochre laid in, and the reference point then becomes, this is the brightest part here. How dark does the shadow actually become? So I feel like I'm 10-20% away still in there. Okay, as you can see now, I've taken the complete wood grain background to a point where it's nearly complete, and I was just talking about the caustic here and the light. I've been really considerate of how bright that is relative to the light tones out here. I'm looking at a gradation from left to right where the saturation, the color of the wood increases in saturation as it gets further away from the brightest point. That saturation is also increasing near the light and shadow boundaries, both along the lines as well as within the cast shadow even. So, darker moment, there's a secondary light source or secondary cast shadow that's creating a ring that's a little higher saturation than the dark in there, higher saturation than the light tone over here. I'm looking at creating the contrast relationship from wood grain that's happening in the shadow. Let's say right here, that same step of value difference is also happening in the light, so that it looks like that wood grain pattern works from the light into the shadow and stays a little continuous that way. Down here near the corner, this is increased in darkness to a point where I'm pretty happy with where it is. It has both the original Tuscan red and dark green layers, and also now a blue indigo layer put down over top of it. Those same colors were used along this thinner band, the width of the table, the height of the table there, but it also has been blended out with the colorless blender so it's not quite as dark, and lighter pressure with those tones so that it's a little bit brighter. And the final step over top of that was the burnt ochre color, just to give it a little bit of the wood, local color of the wood in there. I do have a gradient that it seems to have this similar quality that's happening here along that vertical edge as well. And so my next step will be to get into the white back here. The napkin that I'm looking at is white. I have a white bag here, so I'm going to look at the colors that we can use in a light tone such as that. Now with those white tones, I'll be using a range of pencils like this. The first one certainly will be a white Prismacolor pencil. I have a grade lavender. The next one, I have a cloud blue. I have a cream, which we may get limited use of on this particular version, and then a jade green. So some of it is kind of a complementary mixture. We get warms and cools, and it's going to be a little bit more complex of a gray tone than literally pulling out a gray Prismacolor and just using that single tone here. So the benefit is complexity. There's bits of warm, bits of cool. We're building the gray tone, and it allows you to have a little bit more room to pick up on some of the gradients like I was doing across the table here within that white surface, whether it's the bag or the napkin. Both of them are white. There's a textural change that will likely happen when I get to the napkin, but in terms of interest in the piece. The white shapes I found compositionally kind of appealing against the lighter wood tone anyway. So I didn't need anything really dark or saturated because I wanted the strength of the eventual sprinkles there to have all that saturation. And the chocolate donuts certainly are nice and dark. So I'm going to start with the shadows, similar to what I'd done with the initial underpainting of the wood grain. And primarily I think I'm going to start with just a layer of the cloud blue. And it's something that I'm not going to show the whole rendering of, but the completion of it will go behind my glass here at a certain point, but I'm going to work in this general area to get this first layer underway. Now this is certainly a light color. I'm going to hatch it out a little bit. But as I mentioned, that the bag itself is a cooler white. It's not a warm white, and especially in the shadow region, I have a warm light set up on the still life. So warm light gives you cool shadows. There's not a lot of translucency to the bag, though there is a little bit as we get closer to the opening. So I'm not going to see a glow necessarily happening at this depth. And I've shifted to the grayed lavender here. A little bit more pressure. I'm going to use the jade green at a certain point as well to encourage the brightness to go a little darker. I'm looking at the relationship here as an area that I can use as a reference point. And the flexibility of having the board not attached to anything gives you room to move this. Mixing the blue back in as I'm getting to a point where I hadn't marked it on the surface yet. I'm going to start bringing the jade in. So there's a bit of a violet cast to that gray, which is, likely not picking up really well on camera. But when we mix violet and green, we get a little bit more neutral gray. Close to a complementary mixture. So I'm squinting at the reference, squinting at the developing tone here. And I know that it needs to go darker still. And so where I'm seeing the tone go, I will need a darker color. And I'm going to lean it a little warmer. If I can get it towards the violet again, I'm definitely going to do that. And so something that's incredibly valuable, incredibly useful, is to have a page of tests like this. This is from this particular drawing. Lots of variations where I'm exploring what's going to happen with the tones. So knowing that it's mixing close to where I've got it here, but I need to get to a point where this is happening. So I'm going to search out a lavender pencil real quick. Alright, so I've got my grayed lavender. And I'm going to use a little bit heavier pressure. to bring that tone to a little closer value to what I'm seeing. I go back and forth here. So I'm squinting and making sure that that's close to where I want it. So I think this is very close to what I need. And as I move forward here, something that's going to happen is that I see the bluish tint more visible. I'm just going to cover up this so I can rest my hand on the drawing without worrying about it. So again, laying in that cloud blue at the beginning. So by doing that layer, it's very bright. Subsequent layers will not go down quite as dark. What I need to be aware of on a light tone here is how dark my original sketch lines were. They were done with a gray. With it being on the edge like that, you can sometimes find those deckled edges curl under and into sort of a shadow relationship anyway. So I've laid those lines in with a little variation in pressure so that it's, hopefully not a coloring book look when you're done. Meaning that it'd be a uniform line. It has some undulation to it, thick and thin, light and dark. There's a gradient to this. There's also something I'm going to mark with the lavender here. Bit of a transition where this form right above seems to cast down something of a shadow onto that plane. So I'm not super worried about the directional marks because they seem to disappear as I weave these lines in, but if you find yourself being a little heavy-handed, it's a good idea to kind of get comfortable with the technique where you feather the stroke, light pressure at the beginning, more pressure in the middle, light pressure on the end. You let that become natural, make little loops as you go. So I'm slowly scratching at the paper, leaving more pigment on as I go. I'm going to keep bringing this dark now down from the keyed in tone back here. And it's very possible that I won't need to smooth this out because I am interested in the complexity of the color and I don't necessarily want it all to get removed or get blended out. So I'm going to continue pushing that a little further. And we'll see that after a while. I'm going to keep moving around and introduce some of this similar coloration down here on the napkin, cast shadow underneath. I was going to go much darker underneath the donuts as they cover and obscure the light a little bit more. This one here. I'm going to start again with the cloud blue. Some light pressure. And this is a very soft edge to the shadow. Disappears almost into the light tone. Whether that's due to the distance that the form is from the surface the shadow is cast upon, whether it's about there's a little bit of a fold to the napkin there that kind of rolls itself into shadow all on its own. But I am mindful of the connection here to this little bit of a triangular brightness that happens in that wood grain that I've already laid in. So this is really faint, but it's encouraging a flat surface for the tones that go over top of it to not go down as dark as maybe they would on untouched paper. So, very similar coloration overall. I will say it's going to be just a touch brighter than what will happen up here. But it does need to be dark enough for any kind of rendering to happen in the light areas on the napkin. Otherwise you could run into trouble if you don't give yourself enough difference between the lights and the shadow tones. Thank goodness for a soft edge, otherwise we'd get this maybe awkward relationship with the donut, creating kind of a tangent along that edge because of that shadow, but because it is such a soft diffused moment, it fades back, so there's likely very little confusion of depth due to that tangent. Alright, so it leans a little more violet right now. We want to dull some of that with the green, the jade green. Alright, so I'm going to continue working on that. I'll complete this back portion here. I may do a few things around with the similar colors. When I move down to the cast shadows from the donuts, I'm not going to start with the cloud blue for sure. There's going to be some warmth bouncing off the donuts, so I'm going to do a little bit of a different mixture. So I'm going to work on the same sort of grouping and color palette that I've got here so far. Haven't touched the cream yet. That's going to be a little bit of a later addition, subtle additions in moments. And then if there are any other little accent colors that I see that need to be picked up, sometimes you'll want some like rainbow of color in the whites. You'll see a little green, you'll see a little red, you'll see a little yellow, and so forth. So I'm going to complete those tones, and we'll come back with the video in a few minutes. Okay, I've laid the gradation from left to right in there. Similar gray tone in the back. It gets a little grayer to help it sink in space. As I've laid it in behind the glass there, there is a coloration shift again, similar to what's happening here on the wood grain. It leans a little more yellow, and I was using a sand color and a cream color to push those a little warmer, a little more yellow, and that has the added benefit of actually burnishing it a little bit, so it smooths it out. So it has a little more distance it can go to warm up, but I want to at least leave a little bit of wiggle room to see how the rest of it develops. See if I need to make any color adjustments across a big spectrum. And right now I think it does lean a little bit light because colored pencil is, relatively hard to remove. It's going to be in your benefit to work a little lighter and pushing a little darker as you finalize tones. So I wanted to bring it back here to also introduce a bit more warmth in here. There's a lot of wood grain, there's orange juice nearby, it's bouncing off, reflecting into it. So I'm going to use a peach and a light peach, and if I need to, the sand color as well, just to neutralize the violet a little bit more. This sort of lilac color that's developed in here. So it's relatively subtle, but I'm not looking to change it overly dramatically. The benefit here is we get that warm and cool contrast happening again. Get little bits of the cool next to the peach laid on top of the paper texture. And it will help the side of the bag here start to feel like it's more connected to its environment and its surroundings. Feel affected by that reflected light. Up in here, maybe not using the peach so much as switching to the light peach. Something I didn't quite get yet, as you get down to this turn of the bag, we have an opportunity for a core shadow and reflected light. So the bottom edge of the bag needs to feel just a little bit brighter. So I should take the space above here just a little bit darker, so it feels like it turns around, becomes a bit of a form shadow. So it really does begin to fade into this kind of cast shadow happening here, where we don't really pick up the sharper edge in this last quarter of an inch. So much softer transition here. And it's not that there's a huge amount of contrast down there, just that little bit of brightness that sneaks back into it, and it's possible that a little white pencil can bring it out a little bit more without making it paper white. And I think I could afford to go just a little bit darker in that cast shadow there. I was using the cream colored pencil here. This is a moment because of the glass that it starts to soften that edge quite significantly. That it go back to the cloud blue. Its edge is pretty sharp on either side. In this moment here, because the glass is like rolling around on itself, it's layers on top of layers, you get a lot more atmosphere sort of affecting that space. So it fades out, softens out, and it does return to a little bit of focus and sharpness. Back here we get a little ripple or wave to that line. So I'm going to continue to look at that. That's an area that I'm seeing needs a little bit more contrast as it is right now. So I'll start knocking that back in. Within the glass, we've certainly got a lot of information that could be confusing. So it's pretty important to squint and remember that we're drawing the ground through this glass. It's not the same kind of thing as sprinkles on a donut or a napkin sitting on a table. There's a lot more potential room for ambiguity and softened edges. So using the colorless blender, if there's a hard edge there, may just fuzz it out just a little bit more. So that feels like it's behind the glass surface itself. Alright, so I'm going to continue working on the white. Start to lay in the cast shadows down here underneath the donuts. And come back up to the bag periodically and start to drop the plane back underneath the top plane there and hit a few wrinkles in there. I'll be using the same pencil tones that I have been using. Now that I've got a few more warm tones, I'm going to be introducing something of a darker and likely something even from what will eventually become the donuts, some of the browns, to darken and deepen in the tones and the cast shadows down there. Alright, moving into the cast shadow from the donuts. This particular napkin has a texture that I'm not going to show every last little shape that I can find, but there are moments where it becomes more high contrast and we can bring some of that detail into resolution, and then there are moments where it definitely is not necessary. We can fade it out. So what I'm looking at in here will be what's the brightest tone of the shadow, and drop that tone over everything. The color here is so gray. It's a clay rose pencil once again, something I was using up in the bag, so there's going to be some unity doing that, even though this cast shadow will eventually go darker. It's also going to act like the cloud blue did, a little bit of a barrier between the paper and some of the next tones, so it won't go as dark as the donut or as the lower corner has gone. The edge of the shadow is a little softer. I was working with a lamp that had a big reflector on it, so I can diffuse that edge a little bit. I'll use the colorless blender to just touch that out into the paper a bit more even. Lay that back here. And it's a bit of a squint again. This is just the first layer. It's got to go darker. And in this area right here, as it connects to the donut, there's a great deal of warmth. So much so that I'll probably switch to another pencil that has a little bit more saturation to bring that into resolution, but I can still take this over this area again, and it's just smoothing the tone out a little bit more. So I'm introducing the gray lavender along the edge of the shadow to darken it, and also add some warm and cool complexity of the gray tones that I'm working with so far. And so that shape that I'm building here, it's still dealing with, well, what's the lightest tone in the shadow? And I continue to squint at the reference and squint at the colored pencil drawing here to compare the tonal range. So it has to go much darker. But again, this becomes the barrier to, you know, going way too dark accidentally. And gives it a sort of like working on toned paper. Gives it a ground that kills the white and makes sure that we don't over see in the shadows, that we don't put too much detail there. So it's not going to have as much contrast as highlight on the glass. Using the colorless blender to push some of those tones together. Okay, I've taken the upper portion of the bag here to a point where it's creating that transition between lightest and halftone, and that means I'm trying to create contrast still within the halftones up here and the shadow side. So this is the darkest part of the light, but it's still brighter than what would represent the shadow side. So a clear distinction there, and that sometimes means you adjust this a little bit darker to make that relationship stand out a little bit better. And so the next process will be to come into the napkin here and introduce some detail, some of the same process, bringing the form to the napkin. There's a subtle form, at the very least there's a gradation across it. So I have a few very faint lines. I've got a separate napkin here to reference as well. There's a grid pattern, and then there's some little dots that hopefully you can see with the light. So I very faintly have drawn in with a cool gray 20% some grid lines to help me plot where those dots actually need to be placed. So I'm going to do a few of those because the tonal range in here is subtle. And then I'm going to also kind of turn the form here. I've already begun that a little bit with the shadow layer. And some of the dots that are already in here, they will absolutely help plot the relationships. I've been looking at the edge of this line as something that's going to start and stop. You know, along that line sometimes we'll have something, sometimes we won't. So a kneaded eraser can help remove those moments where they're not really going to be present. And ultimately kind of draw around the line that I had there. So I'm looking to kind of better define the bounding box that the dot pattern resides within. It's going to be really boring if I do this for all of them. But I'm trying to count. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. I was referencing this earlier, but it's much more visible on these that the upper left version of that dot is going to receive quite a bit more contrast, and we're going to receive some brightness on the other side, which means I'm not going to draw that for the moment because I can't draw white on top of a white paper surface. And I'm going to keep these overall pretty faint because I'm not looking to compete in terms of a pattern with the eventual donut here. The next layer staggers inward a little bit, so there's also a vertical relationship. Anytime you've got a pattern, you want to look for those relationships, whether it's a very ordered pattern like a grid or it's random pattern. Any vertical, horizontal, diagonal relationship that you can make, so it's got to go up and it's got to go in an angle. It'll help you kind of coordinate where these things land. Certainly not as much to discuss as I do this, so I'm going to take some time, fill some of these in, and get to a point where I can bring in this subtle shading and go in and around and save some of those bright moments. Okay, I've laid in some of the texture, a little bit darker, and now it's time to continue pushing the actual halftones and light tones of the napkin a little darker to show the undulation. Again, I've sort of started it down here where there's a little bit of a more visible wrinkle as it affects the contour and cast shadow edge there. So that's a good place to start again. So I'm moving into working with some cool grays. I got a 30-20%. If necessary, I've got another one that's a little darker. I don't anticipate needing it. I'm going to use the cloud blue that I was using on the box, or not the box, but the bag. I'll be working with the gray lavender again, and there may be some moments of cream. The white pencil is also going to be a useful tool. So I don't want to sort of just go with the grays. I think it's important to mix those tones. And so one of the things I'll do with the cloud blue here at the beginning is similar to the bag. I've got this gradient that works towards the back edge, allowing it to have a little bit more contrast with the border right now. Sort of vignette or push the viewer into the space. I'm going to think about that working back up into the corner of the napkin here, right here, and bringing just that last little edge back a bit over, turn it away from the light source. And there's some subtle moments where this is casting a little larger shadow. I want to encourage a little bit of brightness right there, and so I'm going to avoid putting the blue down. This is really subtle, so I'm sneaking up on it so that I don't need to find a different relationship later on, bringing just a little bit of variety to the white there. So again, looking for those moments where that napkin kind of undulates up and down. And as I look into the napkin, is there reason to sort of touch it, transition it back, where if I compare any of the napkin white to an actual shine or specular highlight on a glass, or even the highlight that's going to happen on the donut, which is brighter. It's a relationship. We really are drawing the donut while I'm drawing the napkin. We're drawing the glass while we're drawing this, so that there's connection and relationship built across. So this is tipping and toning this a bit. I am going to save a little bit of white. I'm going to push that back. Likewise, this is a large form here. There's more opportunity to use line with such a light pencil because we can barely see it. So I do find myself hatching a bit more. So a little bit of undulation there. And so I'd continue working this around, but since I'm working in this general area right now, I would probably move to the grayed lavender again. I had a touch of it already in this space here. So I was hatching a little bit more vertically with the blue. I'm going to cross that with the lavender. And this is just introducing some of the same coloration that I have up on the top of the bag. It's really a very similar white. I don't have a yellow napkin or anything like that. It's very similar, and in my mind that's helping to build certainly brightness contrast relationship. It's surrounded by wood grain, surrounded by the border, but there's going to be a textural difference. So while it's repeating the same whites, it's adding another layer of variation and difference between them, which is certainly compositionally about encouraging the viewer to look into the piece and appreciate it a little bit more. As I'm getting to the donut here, the cake of the donut, certainly more of an orange color, and I do see it kind of reflecting down into the white a little bit, and it's something I probably will eventually adjust in the shadow. So while I'm thinking about it, this is the cream color. I was using it on the bag to kind of help transition and turn the halftones from the brightest brights into some of the darker colors. But it's also really useful here to warm up the gray. And mixing that with the gray lavender, you get a nice warm neutral. Bringing the lavender, since that darkened it a little bit, bringing it down back into this turning sort of volume. And that was good to do because it introduces a little bit more range of of value that I need to find. Turning down into this valley. So that increased contrast helps the height, helps it lift. I'm going to stop short of just getting it exactly where I want it because I've sort of drawn over some of the dots here, and I want to go back in, push those just a little further, and then if I need to draw around the dots, I can do that. Some of this is overlapping into the cast shadow, and I want to cool this a little bit more, so I'm going to move to the 30% cool gray. Bring that value a little lower and darker. There's a little bit of a wrinkle there. So just looking to cool that a little bit. I'll cool it in here, mixing the warms and the grays. Alright, so one of the things I'm looking at while I get focused on details is also to step back, zoom out a bit, see the whole napkin itself, and bring some attention to that. The light source is a little bit more centered back here, hence the cast shadow is falling this direction. So there's a brightness gradient across here. That's one of the reasons the cool blue, cloud blue, was useful here. And so it's something on a quick sort of global adjustment. You can look at dropping this down just a little bit in value, but certainly in temperature. Cool the white out a little bit. This has the added benefit of, again, protecting the paper a little bit. So if I end up going too dark with one of the dots, it's easier to remove, whether that's with an X-Acto or the eraser. So doing that so it's a little bit brighter up there, and I would even warm up the white just a bit here. So taking the cream, this is really light pressure at the moment, just letting it drag across. So that warm's going to play against the violets that are in the shadow side here a little bit. Give it a little bit more contrast. And it's going to better kind of integrate the wood grain that's happening there ever so slightly. It's so subtle. But it's worth looking at. So as I was working with the cloud gray, then it's useful here to be thinking about the 30% gray and working some of those original tones, maybe just a little bit darker. Seeing this undulation come back into play. So I'm going to continue doing that, and then once I'm to a point where it needs just a little bit more, I'll start working in the dots. So I'm going to go around and globally kind of affect some shapes, push some shadow shapes back into more of a form, and I'll work on the dots. Okay, with the gradient from cream to grayed lavender, cloud blue, and a little bit of the cool gray, 30%, indicating the brightness of the light in the back towards the foreground. I'm going to go in now and more clarify some of these dots. So the initial lay-in was pretty loose, not really precise yet. So I'm going to pick and choose those moments. So it's going to start with the cool gray being not the shadow side of essentially the bowl shape. If you look at my hand right now, there's shadow on this side because the light's behind me, brightness on this side because the light is hitting it. So we get the shadow side at the top. We're going to get some brightness on the other side, which means I'm going to take the tone around it, and either the dot in the middle is going to be brighter or this rim is going to be brighter. And sometimes it varies from one to the other based on how the interior of these sort of ellipses and ovals are formed. If they have a lot of volume inside, they get some brightness on the inside too. It's also, looking at variation, there's a linear pattern that happens with the gridded dots, and it's got a little dash kind of relationship in there as well. So I'm moving around and looking for variety. Darken a little bit, light in another area, playing with the irregularities that I can see, which gives you a lot of license to mess up and blame it on the abnormalities that are happening on the napkin, which is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. So it gives you a lot of room to experiment and make mistakes, and it still ends up looking pretty clean, pretty accurate, because we're not expecting a perfect gridded pattern on a napkin shape. Alright, I'm bringing some tones now around the dots, and mostly I'm using the grayed lavender, the cool gray 30 for the darks, cool gray 10%, and white if necessary. And so the first pass would be it's going to turn the dots kind of into a belly button. We kind of go around them. We save some brightness in the middle and the dark at the top. So introducing that just a little bit of a warm gray around things to kind of circle them and then adjust away from. So shifting back to the cool gray. Each space here, it's a divot, then it goes up, then it's a divot, then it goes up, then it's a divot. It all has form. So as much as you want to care about that, you can start to imagine that volume going around it, and then connecting it with the next one. There's a lot of space to over-render here. You you certainly can take the whites and kind of brighten things back up, burnish it back in. But something I'm looking at is how is the contrast developing towards our focal point. So I don't really need to render much out here. They kind of fade out anyway as the edge of the paper starts to come into play. It seems to flatten the dots and the openings just a little bit more. So it does seem like there's shifting levels of depth. There certainly are lots of opportunities for variety, though, within this. Variety of dots, variety of edges, and I'm shifting back and forth here between temperature a bit. I'm looking back here and how dark that has gotten, and I want to continue pushing that a little bit, and maybe even for a moment take my kneaded eraser and brighten it just a little bit. It went on a little dark maybe. So if you feel like you have a heavy hand, I would say start near your focal point and work away and slowly build that attention and subtlety as you get further away. So again, I'm going around the dots so that they end up having a little bit of brightness. And then within those dots, they're not going to be completely empty. There is a gradation going across it anyway, but within that dot, it is brighter on the bottom than it is at the top. So you can also introduce just a little bit of a mark in there, and sometimes they have a line going on within them. So again, variety. So the tedious part now is to bring some resolution around. They do seem to gravitate towards those moments of transition from light to dark. Whether it's on the hillside here, that really faint bit of shadow shape, where there's a little bit of a more raking light hitting those moments. So you get some stronger potential for contrast going on up here. The nice upper shadow, sort of an inner shape. As I was laying in the kind of global gradation, certain areas lost a little bit of their drawing contrast, but you got to be confident that you drew it once, you can draw it again. Not worry about losing the drawing. So going around Bring the white pencil in. Alright, so I'm going to take some time and do a little bit of this around here, come back and point out what I've done. Alright, so I've taken and pushed the contrast relationships with both shadow across the surface here, very faint halftones. Each one of these little dots has more or less become a little bit of a bowl shape, where there's a little bit darker tone on one left top side, and it's a little brighter on the opposite side. Not every single one has something going on inside of it, but that's just to produce something that's still pretty quiet. I'm not trying to over-render what's happening here. Just gives the illusion that there's some texture and pattern without over-detailing, so that the eye will focus more on the donut shape because of its pattern and color. So this is to help distinguish between it and the bag in terms of some texture, similar color palette, really using exactly the same colors, just added the 30% gray, cool gray, and a little bit of the 10% cool gray, so that there's really no reason to mix color over a small little line. Whereas on a big passage we can blend, build up colors from multiple pencils so that it's a little bit more complex. As we get to something that's pretty much a single line or a little bit of shading, it's hard to push that coloration. But I have gone in with the grayed lavender and put a little bit of it throughout, so that there's both a little bit of mixing with the gray and replicates what's happening up on the bag itself. And so the next step is to work towards the glass. I'm saving the donuts for last. So I'm going to bring into it, first and foremost, the framing of the orange juice. I want to see the contrast of the glass and the heavy base around that at least begin to develop first. Finished edges and contours will happen after there's orange juice in there as well. But definitely bringing some of the darks into play. So I'm going to get those pencils ready now. Alright, so the colors that I'm going to start with, and I anticipate needing some more, but I'm going to work down towards the base first. As I get more comfortable with what's happening there, I'll move up to the top portion, but since the eye gravitates towards the rim of the top, and this is overlapped by the donut, this is room to kind of practice and make sure that the colors are blending right. Now I've used my scrap sheet here to test out a few things as well, but I'm starting with dark and light umber. I'll be using a goldenrod, and I have the yellow ochre ready if it's necessary. A steel or warm gray. I'm going to sort of experiment with both of those a little bit. First and foremost here, we want to make sure that the darkest dark is sort of defined early on, and get that shape accurate. So I have some initial lines roughed in, but you shift your viewpoint on the base of the glass and it's going to totally change. So photo reference can be pretty helpful if you're working from life, just to kind of crystallize where you want your glass shapes to be. Otherwise you got to find that landmark to keep working from. Meaning you identify a shape that, maybe you can give it a name. It looks like a state, looks like an eye, or there's something else in there that you can keep returning your point of view to. That is immensely helpful in something like this. So definitely starting with the darks. I'm looking at shapes, and there's room to simplify or design your shapes as needed. I'm not burnishing this down really hard here at the beginning. That ensures that we land these lines in the right spot, even if it takes an adjustment. So this is a weird spot because it kind of changes the perspective. It's not following the ring. It kind of flattens out a little bit there. So that's something I really am keeping an eye on. And really use a sharp point, so I'm going to sharpen this real quick. It's going to go on darker, certainly when you do that. Each stroke you make, it's more likely to put down a dark point. But while it's sharp, get in there and do something that really needs to be clean. So that top edge, while it's got a little bit of a fuzzy moment, relatively speaking, the depth of it is a little bit lower in the composition. I still want it to be pretty clear. And it's really easy to lose your perspective here, so if you've got this moment disappearing over there, be looking for just a little double check to make sure that it's going to happen in the same spot on the other side. Clean up that outer edge for a moment. I'm looking at the reference that allows me to kind of crystallize where this shape that I like is found. So I'm going to push that in a little bit darker. Relative to the darkest dark down here, I think it's pretty close, so pretty much using just the umber for the moment because it's got a nice sharp point. If I feel like it needs another tone, which is pretty likely, I'll do that in subsequent layers. Now there's also a gradient. It's nice to have the darkest dark here in the front. That allows it to kind of pull forward like a core shadow on an opaque object. Darker darks here will still help the depth to come forward. So it fades out, so I'm not going to really anchor these moments in there too dark because I want them to have room to gray, and they stay relatively warm in temperature, though next to what ends up being kind of a yellow ochre color. it kind of looks cool. So it's a little bit of simultaneous contrast. That neighboring or adjacent color will affect the way we end up perceiving the original color. Hopefully that's something you've heard before. But it can make color picking a little more challenging here. All right, there's not a lot more to really get in there with this, but I likewise want to take and introduce the highlight. So I got my white pencil, and for this I'm shifting between a couple pictures. I like the highlight happening in one better than the other. So there's a trick here. You know, let's zoom in really good here. This is something I'll use on the sprinkles as well. So I'm gonna put some white down. And if I take then, just the warm gray, near where the white is, get it to overlap a bit, you can still get a really nice dark tone. Let's say I'm bringing it in from the other side. And I could even cover it up here a little bit. So if I then take an X-Acto knife and really scrape against the paper surface, having that white barrier between the paper and the subsequent layer allows you to scrape back nearly to perfect white. So it's a beneficial initial pass to take over the area where the highlights tend to be. So that's what I'm going to do. Just lay it in. And I'm going to lightly lay it in so it grades out a little bit. But I'm going to lay it in. Some of these marks are already kind of helping me define where the highlight was. And this is just preventative. What happens if I need to correct something, then I can scrape back down. So I may not need the white more on this particular area now. But it's a much more yellowish tint, and it's something that is going to start with a little bit of goldenrod, I believe. And taking that goldenrod with a little bit of jade green, a little bit of white blending over, I think we're going to get the tone that I'm after. And it's also worthwhile to maybe pick up a gray tone as well. So I'm going back to a warm gray, 20 and 30%. I'm going to err on the side of 20% first. Take that over the umber line. And this goldenrod color will act like an undertone. It needs to be present in the glass. There's going to be lots of mixing, darker, grayer at times, greener even. Just double checking I haven't gone over the highlight accidentally yet. Always an issue to be aware of. Now the highlight doesn't go all the way to the edge. So the edge is going to get a little bit of this more saturated color. And I'll be looking at the shadow to clarify that edge as I get a little closer. Shifting back to the warm gray, and I think I'm going to move up to the 30%. And I'm working negatively around the highlight. Blend over some of the goldenrod. Move over to a light umber. Sometimes the shapes in the base of a glass take on kind of a wood grain pattern. Get this kind of crescent shape, big C shape as a beginning form to work out of. And then it ends up being stretched and pulled, whether it's softened or you get some longer strokes out of it. On the other side, this is nowhere near finished, but I'm bouncing around with the pencil that I've got sort of loaded up. Lay that color lightly in there. So the light umber and the goldenrod mix, creating a little bit of a greenish yellow. And if I need to add a little bit more, I can do that, but it's something of a distinction between what the orange juice color will be here and down there. There's just a little tint towards green, and it's not quite happening here yet, and I don't want the umber to darken too much. So I've got the jade green again that I'm going to lay that lightly across here. And around to the side, wanting that to green out a little bit. A little bit of colorless blender, if I haven't misplaced it, so I can really fully see the value. The mixture of those colors is nice, and pairing that against the stronger pressure here, looking for this to rather zigzag and cut. Okay, I'm moving on to the top of the rim. I'm working with dark green, light umber, and a little bit of goldenrod. Those are the primary colors right now in it. They've literally just been in there to define the contours and the boundaries. So it's really key and important that we trace and follow the line, because your contour will start, frequently on the inside and twist around and become the outside edge. So you can see this dark green line starts on the inside, becomes part of the middle right around here, and then it transitions to the back edge and then fades into the light umber. So really trace and follow along those contours. Again, this one, the green is on the outside, corkscrews in to the inside of the top edge. There's also a moment here where the light umber starts at the top and works across to become the bottom. And the bottom is yellow and light umber, corkscrews across here and becomes part of the top. It's also part of the bottom as well, but it twists around there. So the more that you can pay attention to what's going on, the easier it's going to be. The next step is to darken. And I certainly don't want the green to be as present as it is right now. So I'm going to twist this around, a little more comfort for where I'm working on right now. I'm using a steel color to desaturate the green a bit and to push it just a little bit further in terms of its darkness. So there's going to be a nice moment right here that's probably one of the darker moments. And then as it's twisting back here, the darker moments on the top, I'm going to have a little bit of a gradient with the green into the yellow. So I'm going to keep working on this area, and I'll do the same thing off camera in a minute. So with the goldenrod and my light umber, so the light umber, as I'm looking at it, is a nice transition here to move towards that yellow. Light umber is also going to gray out the green just a little bit. Really be keyed in on the thickness of your rim, and be careful that it doesn't get too thick once you realize all this cool stuff and all these cool lines and shapes are going on in there. It's easy to just amplify the thickness too much. Need to touch back that whole space. There's no white here, so that needs to get worked out. I've placed down a bit of white colored pencil already in here for the highlight. Direction of the light source will get you 2 highlights here on the rim. But by putting that white colored pencil down already, again, it's protecting the paper. That way, if I needed to scrape back with the X-Acto knife to find the highlight again, I can rely on that barrier of white to make it easier. It's protecting the paper from the darker colors that you're laying on top. I also have a jade green here if I need it. If the dark green and yellow goldenrod end up not making the right color, I think I'm going to use it a little bit. Back to that steel gray for a minute. Over to the light umber. Just going back and forth, darkening things just a little bit. This is providing a little more saturation because it's a lighter color. You can also burnish with it a little bit as well. I haven't been really playing too much with atmospheric depth and perspective because the deepest element is a pretty light color. I haven't had to worry too much about it, but on the rim of the glass, it's worth thinking about as the tones develop a little bit more darkness, to be mindful of making sure that the front edge and front half sort of advance in space. just a little bit more than the back. So don't over exaggerate the darks back here if you're too heavy-handed. It may be worth starting on the front so that you can create that maximum limit. Don't go any darker than this. To save yourself a hassle down the road. I'm going to pull out the colorless blender here real quick and just see if it doesn't take the umber darker than all that I really need there. But it looks like I'm going to need a little bit more. Just a touch darker. It's on the bottom of the rim. Corkscrews over the middle here. And becomes part of the top edge. And this is not something that I want to stand out again a lot. But those are interesting moments, to be sure. And it's not that we necessarily fully observe it in our day-to-day life, but it looks odd if it's not there. Alright, so moving towards the highlight here, it's got a bit of grayness, so I'm going to pull out the 20% warm gray. It's got a little bit of grayness around the highlight because we're starting to pick up bits from behind the bag there, just a little bit. And the top portion, a bit more saturation right next to it. Amp up the dark here. I'm not opposed to starting a little bit more goldenrod in there as well. Some of the rim though here, I'm not going to be able to do quite yet because I haven't clarified the ground behind it, and your rim is very determined by what's in the background. So I'm going to keep going a little bit with this. Take the rim as far as I can get it. I'm pushing the gray back over the green just to neutralize it a little bit more. It's just a bit too green. And then we'll start working on the orange juice. All right. The next step for me is working on the orange juice that we can see in the open part of the cup. And I'm going to start from the outer edge. The outer edge ends up kind of separating in terms of the liquid. And we have kind of a cooler ring surrounding that cooler ring is surrounding a slightly saturated version. And so I'm starting here with a cool gray 10%. I have some of my highlight resolved, but for sake of expedience here, I'm just going to do part. The part without it. So just a little light undercoat here. I don't need to bring it to the front. And just, based on transparency here, yellow ochre seems to go over and create the tone I'm looking for here. I'm going to feather it in and just keep an eye on the contrast relationship with the bag, the shadow in the bag behind it. Bringing this contrast to a point where it's seems appropriate. And this is always the time where it's quite possible something needs to go darker relative. If this needs to go darker than where it is, as I see this develop, the bag may need to go just a little bit darker. Sunburst Yellow is my next one. So it's going to have a little bit more strength to the saturation with the same amount of pressure. And I'm going to just feather it across this space, meaning I'm going to leave a softer edge here so I can pick it up once I've gotten a little further on it. The top part of the rim, there's no highlight there, so I can go right up to that edge. I really want to pay attention to strokes. If I leave any strokes, I don't want them to kind of reinforce the ring of the rim, so it's useful to cross back and forth at gentle angles to kind of get rid of that rhythm. I'm not trying to push a lot of pressure down yet. And I'm just going to sharpen this real quick. Building that up, switching back to the yellow ochre for a minute. It's a little bit darker color, so the sunburst yellow is going to mix back and forth here with the yellow ochre. Sunburst providing saturation, strength, yellow ochre adding a little bit of value. And I'm going to keep squinting back here. This needs a little bit more. Because it's a cooler ring, it's almost exactly the same value as the inner ring with the sunburst yellow. checking. I don't see much of any kind of gradient across the top in this section here. Maybe a little cooler over there, but it's almost negligible. Squinting, squinting. This is brighter than that for sure. Brighter than that for sure. Brighter than that. But I do think the bag, that violet back there.
I can't find the answer to the question I heard.
So I do think that violet back here needs to be pushed a little bit darker. I'm also interested in bringing this a little more even, burnishing it. With the sand color. If I push the sunburst yellow to the point where it burnishes it, it's going to end up being too saturated. If I use white, it's going to brighten it. So it's good to get to know the pencils a little, which ones are going to help you out, and how does it affect the color underneath. So sample pages, test swatches, those are all invaluable to making sure you're not making a mistake. So the other thing I can look at back there is a bit of a sort of umber color. Wrapping around. And I think the transition there could be the yellow ochre. Getting a lot of use out of the yellow ochre on this drawing. It's in the blonde of the wood, it's in the orange juice, it's likely going to be in the donut. Alright, so I'm going to carry on completing the top portion up here, working around the highlights, and you know, when I get down into this area here, it's going to be about reflections overlapping. It's basically the same tone here, it's just going to lean a little bit greener as I move downward. So I'm working now down into the height of the orange juice, and it is typically much darker than you think it is. How I'm going to get started is with some canary yellow. Right up to the edge. It's a little cooler in comparison to what's happening right there, at least on that edge. But I'm going to lay this in over this whole space. Pretty loose, pretty quick. The sprinkled donut is reflected in here, so I'm going to work really light on this because some of the white sprinkles that would be reflected would be a little bit brighter and not so deep in yellow. This is a reflection with the napkin, but it's nowhere near white. So it's a pretty neutral color, similar to this sand. Color, so I'm going to knock that in there. Come back over here with the canary yellow. And just continuing to add a second layer and doing that in such a way that the layers go down light, slowly build up. It helps to ensure that we don't lay more wax on the surface than we really actually need. Which gives you room to continue to manipulate and find the tones that you're looking for. But again, I'm going to focus on this area over here. So it's brighter at the top, but that needs to be warmed up a little bit. I'm going to try a little Spanish orange. Alright, so this is a reflection. This is more of a shadow. My goal would be to put the brightness relationship of the reflection, which is brighter, over the shadow as well. And this whole tone from about here down to here is darker than anything up there. So that's one of the early relationships we need to build. Switching over to a goldenrod to get a little grayer and a little darker. Back to the Spanish orange here, a little more pressure. We find a good deal of saturation. Along this band. And then I'm going to switch to a burnt ochre. You know, some of the same color that I was using in the wood grain. And I'm going to really encourage this shadow form here. Good place to build up the tone right along that edge. So you can see that contrast with the table. It does seem like I'm going to need to go a little darker than that, so I'm going to find the dark brown. Have that one available. Pulling a little bit of the sunburst yellow from what I was using up there down into this. And I'm going to continue blending these till I get a little bit more of this contrast relationship built throughout this lower half. We'll see how much I can get it to go. Alright. Alright, I'm working up the reflection of the donut in the orange juice. I've lightly drawn in the sprinkles that are reflected with a goldenrod color, which is something that'll mix into this tone pretty easily. And I've already begun to take the burnt ochre in and draw the ground. So I'm refining the shapes of the sprinkles as I do that, making corrections as needed, because the goldenrod is really more of a layout. They're still movable if necessary. Some of the other things that are happening in here, there's some coolness in the reflection over on this side. So I've been using the 10% cool gray as a base, and the sand pencil to just touch this back so it's not pure white, and it could still probably do with going back a little bit further. It stands out a little bit too much right now. So the sand pencil it's a good one to also continue kind of burnishing this smoothness. Without using the colorless blender for everything. Bringing a little bit more saturation back down into it on this side. And I'm still going to come over top of that with a little bit of the yellowed orange, like I've done over here, so that it ensures that there's consistency between the two sides and I don't get a weird contrast. So I'm going to keep developing that. As I look at that, this still may need to go back a little bit darker as well. If the sand doesn't do that enough, then I'll probably touch it with a little bit of yellow ochre. Just to knock it back so it doesn't feel too bright. But I'll continue looking at that relationship, both right to left and up and down. So up here, there's a little bit more coolness. It's a little warmer in this area, so the sand plays against the 10% gray pretty nicely there. So I'm going to continue taking these sprinkles and drawing around them. And eventually I'll be working up the colors in there. And it's going to be very yellowed. Everything will have the appearance of a touch of yellow-orange in it because there is orange juice behind them. There's orange juice as part of the ground, and so figure and ground interact with each other, and it's all just grayed versions, or it leans just a hint closer to red or a hint closer to green in each sprinkle. So it's very unlikely that I'm going to pull out the whole rainbow of colors. I'll be using grays to cool things, not using blues. I'll be using the maybe sunburst yellow a little bit more to play against a grayer ground, if you call that grayer, relative to full saturation yellow. So that's something I can think about a little bit right now, even because yellow is so bright. I can drop that one in. I know that one's going to be yellow. There are no other yellow ones reflected. There's a lot of white ones, and so the white ones also kind of fade back into the ground. Can do that a little bit, so there's a little gradation starting to happen on those. Alright, so I'm going to finish up the ground and we'll come back for some sprinkles. Okay, so I've taken the background behind the sprinkles in the reflection quite a bit further. Ready for some broader saturation changes and coloration of the sprinkles themselves. So there's some things that I want to encourage with the gradation. We've got burnt ochre here again, just very faint. Bring that in there. Looking for a little bit more dark, just a little bit. And using the yellowed orange to capture some of the saturation that I have over here. I'm going to bring that in, and I'm using a fair amount of pressure. It's burnishing the the surface a little bit more. So it's increasing the saturation along that ring. I think I can bring it over here a little bit more as well. And so in this area, it feels grayer as a result. The burnt ochre needs some of this orange thrown in. And I'm looking at the sprinkles as atmospherically in a space, in some distance. I'm going to take a few here and knock them back with the orange as well, so that it's not screaming for some attention. There's a lot of these up here at the top. Could take a little bit of that orange without any problem, but pushing that burnt ochre a little more saturated. But it's a push and pull. I may have to come back in and darken a little bit more. We'll see. So I'm going to carry that through the majority of this space here. In some cases, yeah, I can hatch and kind of blend right over a sprinkle, as long as I don't lose the contrast that I want. So some you go around, some you stay on top of. The goldenrod was a really important color in this whole process, and I've used the white pencil to kind of burnish this area here and create that illusion of some brightness. Taking a light umber, bringing that on the other side here, create a little bit more contrast. So I'm looking at squinting, finding those moments that stand out during that squint and bring attention to them if I've somehow lost that contrast. Alright, I'll nitpick a lot more of this stuff, but some of the patterning of the color, I want to get in and take care of that. There's an orange one. This long one is an orange one, so I'm going to take the same pencil I was using to burnish this down, the yellow to orange, lay it over top. I'm not looking to render these things, but let them fade. The top part of the sprinkle kind of disappears up into the top portion here. So it's very much a study in edges, where maybe sharpening an edge and then losing an edge. This brighter one here, it's a white, no, it's a yellow. It's got a more or less sharp edge there, and a softer edge on the bottom. And it's yellow, so I'm going to touch back to canary yellow. And the sunburst. Catch just a little variation there. I am looking at that orange sprinkle and wanting to see it go a little bit oranger, so pull out an orange Again, not a lot. And while this one's out, grab that, knock that back a little bit orange. This one leans a little orange. So the sprinkles are going to start to fade in and out just based on the local color. Got a red one up there. We'll drop that back with orange as well. Beginning the donuts here, I'm going to be working with Tuscan red and dark brown, laying in some of the darker shapes and strong light and dark contrast that I can see up there. So the first step really is to kind of split light and shadow. And because I'm working with a light touch right now, as you're squinting, if you can reduce the midtones into either light or shadow, just make that call, make that decision. That's what I'm looking to do. I'm looking for an immediate kind of flat layer here, at least with the first pass here with the Tuscan red. Separate light and shadow. So I'm removing all of the extra contrast that you might be inclined to kind of oversee within a shadow space. Because there's form in here for sure, but how much of it is absolutely necessary? And the shapes that I'm using certainly come from the original layout sketch, but that doesn't mean that they're always entirely accurate. So I'm drawing as well right now. I'm trying not to just kind of mindlessly fill in and trace between the marks that I've already laid on the surface. I picked Tuscan red because of the reddish undertones that exist in the chocolate. At least under the lighting situation that I have right now. So again, these are going to be a quick kind of impression of light and shadow. And, there's all kinds of stuff going on here that I didn't take the time to totally draw in. So as you're developing something, you need some landmarks. Start with the big shapes before you get to the little details. It'll make the little details easier to place if you've already gone in with the large shapes. It would, it'd be similar to trying to draw a map of the U.S., including locations of capital cities and big cities. Do that without having the state outlines, and you'd have a lot of trouble. When you put those landmarks, the big shapes of the states in, it's going to be easier to locate, say, the capital city within that space. Same idea. There's some detail elements within a big shape like this, but before I have it in there, I wouldn't try to just plot a spot without knowing exactly where that is. Alright, so I'm going to take some time to bring the light and shadow contrast on both donuts here into play. The sprinkles here I'm going to just work in and around, and you'll come back and see that nice, almost like one tone contrast relationship, white and one tone. Alright. With the one color, Tuscan Red, I've gone in and essentially created a local color. I've saved everything but the highlights and the sprinkles on this case. On the turned one, I've done a little bit more rendering, given sort of a step, dark, middle, lighter, and then brightest highlights that you can find there. It's literally going to let the Tuscan Red kind of show through, smolder a little bit underneath. It's got a red tone to the chocolate. My next step is a dark brown, and it's to begin blending. Begin pushing this a little bit darker. And it's important to not try to hit the tone perfectly with the first layer or two, but allow yourself some time and room to build this up. I'm not pushing hard in here because I know I'm going to need to go over it again with some other colors. What I am already thinking about, though, is this drizzle of chocolate has volume and form, which means it's going to pick up core shadows, reflected light. So I've allowed that Tuscan Red to feel a little bit more like reflected light, and I'm starting to push essentially a core shadow into this. The opposite side here is a plane that is mostly hidden from the light. I'm not getting any reflected light on it, so it ends up being a little bit darker still. So there's 1, 2, 3 tones starting to work across there. Bring the Tuscan Red back for a moment. Push that a little bit darker. And as this is developing, I'll eventually get to the cake portion so that I can better get a grasp of the contrast relationship that's necessary here. A little bit of back and forth, because I want the color to be there. This is a dark area, is a good place to get a feel for the colors, how they're working together if you haven't fully pursued it on your scrap pages, test pages. So I think it's also in need of some sort of dark, maybe the indigo. I don't know that the dark green will be really useful, but I'll pull it out again. So these are the colors that I was using down in the lower quadrant to get a nice rich dark. This particular part of the donut, I don't think it needs to get nearly that far. But there is a moment over here, and so that might be worthwhile to kind of key the color relationship here, is to bring this as the dark is dark, do a little bit more of a resolution. It's got, as a result, even a cooler bluish cast to it. Sharpen this pencil. Bring that blue, indigo blue. And then it's going to be way too blue, like immediately, I know that. So the green is going to be needed. Get a little bit of the green in that same space. And, you know, back over with the Tuscan red. I'm looking at the outer edge, and if I bring the value out a little bit, that's probably still a little bit too bright there. And it's way too red-violet. So I need to gray that out. And within such a small little area, it's likely I'm just going to use a gray pencil itself. And I'm thinking a warm gray, because I don't want it to go too cooled out. And a little bit of white. The jade green color is also a decent one to desaturate that a little bit. But it's worth experimenting, you know, with your Tuscan red color. If I end up taking the white pencil over top of just that, it goes very pink, like very magenta. That's likely not the color you want everywhere. In fact, it feels much bluer, at times rather desaturated in comparison. So it is something to keep your eye on, and relative to what I have going on right now, I think there is room to gray it out a little bit more. Alright. Swapping back and forth between pencils, trying to remember which one I want to go to next. Back to the blue just to darken it a little bit more. And I'm going to pull the colorless blender out because the burnishing that happened on the reflected light there has a very different texture. And I want to maintain similarity so it feels like it's on the same surface, essentially. Alright, so rolling that up into this area, we're going to take and deepen the Tuscan red a little bit. There's a touch of the cake visible in this space. It runs right through here. So going to a red-brown terracotta. I'm going to start to layer that in there as if it's kind of showing through a thinner layer of chocolate. Some of this color could work its way down into the cake itself, but we'll wait and see. I'm going to use the dark brown now to push this a little further. And mixing back and forth, back to the Tuscan red. Down there trying to save that reflected light, I'm going to move to the cake color again for a second. And I'm going to throw a little bit of the warm gray over top of that, and a little bit of white. So that gives me a spot to push towards. So it's got to go darker than that. That's the reflected light. Color's got to come down a little bit darker. I'm going to bring pretty much my go-to pencil on this thing, the burnt ochre. There's a lot of it throughout. I think it's worthwhile to bring that into here as well. I'm liking the color that that's creating. So it'll be a nice unifier. This happens in much of the composition, like 70% of it. There's a little bit of it somewhere. And I'm starting to move out to some reflected light. And in terms of what color it has, it is a very warm gray. And my clay rose color would be a nice burnisher. So I'm going to leave that one out. And I'm going to pull out a warm gray, about 30%, if I can find that one. Okay. Some light pressure. I do need some contrast relative to the napkin. And this was the pencil I used to actually outline it. So it'll be good to bring it back around, let that outline fade in a bit. Light pressure so I can go darker over that. There is a coolness to the space back here. A little bit of blue. Drop that in. Back to the warm gray, 30. So you see the blue temperature, hopefully. Clay rose. Come back in and warm that up a little bit. A little back and forth, warm and cool. Back to the 30. So as far as the contrast goes out there, I think this is close to where I want it. Can always use the white to brighten it just a little bit more. So it's a decent mid-tone. It's got a touch of warm, it's got a touch of cool to it. I'm going to grab the colorless blender. Just work it together real quick. That does bring out the Tuscan red, so I'm going to end up touching over that with something a little a little paler. A little too much. Warm it up a little bit with some beige. Alright. So I'm going to keep working back towards the middle there. Tuscan red needs to be present again. It's got a grade outward. Grab that burnt ochre. Warm gray. Good blender. The blue is showing a little bit more than I want right now. So I'm going to shift to the dark brown. So when in doubt, thinking complementary terms, color terms, the blue needs a little bit of orange to neutralize it. And there's definitely orange present in the burnt ochre. Move that around a little bit. So I'm going to keep layering these colors as I'm going, and start to take this around there a little bit more. I'll be jumping back and forth, I think, between the two donuts, and we'll come back when there's a little bit more exciting stuff happening. I'm working on the sprinkle donut now. The background is coming up nicely. I've been mixing similar colors to what I've been using down in the corner here to get a nice dark. It's the Tuscan red, it's the indigo blue, and for the most part I've avoided the dark green and choosing to use a selection of other pencils here. Burnt ochre is very limited. I actually don't need that one. Sienna brown I'm getting a lot of use out in the turning of the form right here to kind of blend out, add a little bit more chocolate warmth to it. And there's my indigo blue. I have a little bit of a dark brown for when something needs to go dark and cooler compared to the Tuscan red, a little bluer. I've got a slate gray, and you can see little bits of that down in some of this reflected light. I've also put it back here to kind of soften that edge and let it drop behind the other donut. There's little bits of indigo blue kind of showing up just for some interesting color. And then I've got a mixture of grays that I'm working with. The clay rose is a really useful transitional step for the brighter tones in here. It's got the right value. It just needs to be cooled a little bit. So as I'm looking at those highlight areas, I'm looking at light pressure, laying a little bit of that clay rose down. And then working with a cool gray, warm gray, little mixture as needed. I'm going to start with the warm gray, see what happens. Just a little bit. Darkens a little bit, starts to push it back into space. cool grays laying over here. Cool this out just a little bit. So it gives a nice bluish cast to it, which is nowhere near as intense as the saturated Tuscan red there. So that particular moment, I'm going to take the dark brown. Let's go a little darker. And that dulls the saturation a little bit. And bring back my clay rose here. So I still have a little bit of saturation. It darkens a little bit out here. Clay rose over that can be a little bit of a burnisher. And then its sprinkle right above there has a little bit of a recessed dark in it. So a lot of these sprinkles have at least one side, if not multiple sides, where it feels like a cast shadow, recessed dark. Adds a little bit of depth. All right, so more dark brown. Just going in and spotting some of these moments. Better defining the sprinkles of this shape. Bring the clay rose back. So I've got the pencils in my hand here, so I can quickly swap them out, and I'm not just like dropping pencils all the time, making lots of noise. Both for the video and my own sensibility. I don't want to hear that clang and clutter. We get some nice light source coming from the left. We get some nice cast shadows dropping down on the right half as these forms start to turn over. So there's a mixture of indigo blue there already. A little bit of blue on that one already. Just going in with the Tuscan red and deepening it a little bit. And my dark brown, because this is a little too red here, and I want this to still be dark, the dark brown starts to neutralize that just a little bit. And as we're moving over this way, we're getting some reflected color off of the orange juice. So that's where the burnt ochre, which I tossed aside briefly, that's where the burnt ochre can come into play. And it's just going to give it a little bit of extra warmth. Benefit also is that it's connecting some of the other colors. There's a lot of burnt ochre in the wood that find it useful to essentially work with a color that can add some consistency, because colored pencils tend to be so compartmentalized. We have a wide range of pencils to work with. You can literally just pick that color and lay it down. If you start to let some of them unify and integrate with others, that's gonna help your picture. And it helps you in terms of choice of pencil. You don't have this huge range to pick from, you've got this smaller subset. So, within all the sprinkles, you know, at a certain point, if you cannot kind of follow where you've already, like where that sprinkle is, if you have trouble finding it at a quick glance, what would be really helpful is to color a couple of them, you know, make that one pink, so that you glance up at the donut and you can see that pink straight away. That could be really useful. process. But there's such a kind of variety to them. There's a few longer ones, smaller ones. There's some open spaces every now and then that I have not had too much trouble with it. Wouldn't say the same about this. This was a little bit more challenging to locate because there's so much more ambiguity about it. But, you know, give yourself a map, essentially. Alright, so I'm just working around, and I'm going to continue kind of desaturating the Tuscan red, introducing the sienna brown in that transitional stage between the darkest dark and the brightest bright. So right along this middle area, you'll see a lot of the sienna sort of happening. And I'm laying it down with some pressure because I try to avoid going around these sprinkles 100 different times. I've already gone around them a couple times. I like this to be the last time in each area till I get to the actual color of the sprinkles. So burnish it down so you get that shiny, glossy texture of the chocolate. Gets pretty dark here, so I'm going to go back to the indigo blue just to cool it out a little bit. And then throw the dark brown over top. Bring my sienna brown back in, transition over it. Alright, so I'm going to keep working around these until I get to the point where I can lay in some sprinkles, some color there. Okay. Now I'm slowly working up the cake of the donut. I've been using the sienna brown, the burnt ochre again, some dark umber. I'll be using goldenrod. I'll definitely be using the orange. So I got 5 pencils here. Should be about all I need. And right now I'm pushing towards a stronger division between the light and shadow. With the sienna brown, there is an obvious textural difference between, you know, glass cake, frosting cake. So I'll be paying attention to that. And so the beginning process here is a little bit more parallel to the surface. And I'm going to be picking and choosing then where I leave sort of textural contrast. The area in here where I'm starting to work and get it closer to the tone I'm after, it does feel a little smoother because it's in the shadow. We can lose the contrast in the shadow. But as we start to push towards this core shadow terminator line, it's more raking light, so that texture becomes more significant and pronounced. And so I will be using the randomness of the grain of the paper here and start to find some shapes out of that. Now I want to be careful here that I don't go too dark before I start to introduce a little bit more color, because that leans a little gray right now and I need to get the goldenrod color back into it. Looking at a cast shadow here, and as I was doing the frosting I'd already kind of put a recessed dark in there, so I want to be looking at that, make sure I don't just have an outline there. I'm going to shift to the burnt ochre. It's got a little bit more of the yellow that's partially due to the reflected light. And I want to be careful since I am using similar colors that I've been using throughout. It would be really easy for the wood grain to start to look like the same color, especially as I start to now introduce color from the orange juice in here. Just to be careful and make sure that I make a distinction between the objects and the surfaces that they have. So saturation wise, that's a good spot to be in right now. I'm going to leave it and kind of match that throughout. So this is the goldenrod. I'm using it freshly sharpened here. We'll be pushing just a little bit more orange, and especially as it's starting to turn into the shadow. And under that ridge there, I need to drop some more orange. And I think I want the chocolate to come down there a little bit more, and so I'm gonna bring that in because it just feels like it's too flat there, and so it's already got this shape coming down off of it. Let's give it a little bit more of a design. I'm going to take the colorless blender and just smooth that out a little bit. Bring back the indigo. It's going to kill that orange saturation that's in it a little bit. We'll leave it alone for a moment. I come back in here, and so there is really very little reflected light that I can actually see on the thickness of that chocolate, at least in the section right here. So I'm just gonna push it back a little bit. And then it's casting a little bit of a shadow, and I said that orange would be more present in there. It's not going to be saturated, but it needs to be more present. It obviously needs to go darker. So I was saying a little bit less texture in the shadow portion. So I'll knock that back, push the strokes out. There's already at least 3 layers on it, so it's getting a little waxier. Right, so that's what I'm looking for, that color. So I'm going to try and match that in a few other spots. That means bringing some more orange back into it. And while I'm here with the orange, I'm going to bring that around. That transition between light and shadow, we get more saturation. So I definitely want to bring out the orange a bit. There's a little bit of light happening back here. More saturated right there. And down here, we're getting some reflected light off the napkin. Can always add more if I need it. Go back and forth. Bring some goldenrod in. And I'm going to let the goldenrod layer into the shadow side a little bit more. I like the green cast that can come from that. Alright, so I'm going to keep working this up. It leans a little orange right now, but the goldenrod, as I bring that over it a little bit more, is going to turn down the orange just a touch. And then I'll move around and get the cake kind of resolved over here, and then it'll be time for the sprinkles. On to the last step here. We're going to start working on the sprinkles. And the big trick that I have here is to try and capture the little bit of shine that happens on a sprinkle, rather than try and save that white space and draw around it. I'm literally going to cover one of these in white. And then take the color, in this case it's poppy red. And since I'm just worried about the highlight at the moment, I'm just going to put it in flat. We take an X-Acto knife and bring some light pressure, not trying to scrape too hard. Come back in and get that highlight. We'll find another one to do it on. And I'm going to push a little harder. I think that could end up being a little more saturated. The other one, first one, maybe is a little dim. So we get a little bit of form on it without a lot of work. So I'm going to take and continue working with the same pencil and move around and dot a bunch of those sprinkles, and then I'm going to move on to the next color, next color, next color, until it's completed. And I'll be back with a finished piece.